The air inside La Toile Filante always felt the same. It was a thick soup of expensive perfume. The faint smell of truffle oil from the kitchen and the quiet, heavy weight of old money. The young woman moved through it like a ghost, her worn-out sneakers making no sound on the thick, dark carpet. Her uniform, a simple black dress with a white apron, was designed to be unnoticed, and she had perfected the art of being invisible. To the people dining here, she wasn't a person. She was a pair of hands that refilled a water glass, a voice that took an order, a shadow that cleared away their empty plates. Her name was unimportant. Her presence was merely part of the expensive decor. She carried a heavy tray balanced perfectly on one hand. On it were 2 glasses of deep red wine and a plate of oysters resting on a bed of ice. She weaved through the tightly packed tables, her body moving with a practiced, fluid grace. She had to be careful. One slip, one wobble, and the evening would be ruined, not just for her, but for the man who would inevitably complain to the manager. As she passed a table of 4, a man in a crisp suit, without even looking up from his conversation, snapped his fingers. "Water," he said, the word sharp and cutting through the low murmur of the dining room. She gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod and continued on her path. His dismissal rolling off her like water off a duck's back. She was used to it. This was her world, a world of stark contrasts. She served people who spent more on one bottle of wine than she made in a week. She listened to them talk about buying new yachts, selling companies, and flying to private islands for the weekend. Their problems were things she couldn't even imagine. A woman at a nearby table was complaining, her voice dripping with frustration, about how her interior designer couldn't find the exact shade of turquoise for her new beach house. The young woman listened as she placed the oysters down in front of a couple who barely acknowledged her. She thought about the crack in the wall of her own small apartment, the one she tried to cover with a poster. She thought about the looming bill for her electricity. These were her problems. They felt much more real than a struggle with turquoise. Her feet ached. It was a constant, dull throb that started in her heels and worked its way up her legs. By the end of a double shift, it felt like she was walking on broken glass. She kept a smile plastered on her face, a neutral, pleasant expression that she had perfected over years of service. It was a mask, and it was one of the most important parts of her uniform. To show any sign of fatigue or frustration was to invite complaints. To be anything less than perfectly pleasant was to be difficult, so she smiled. Even when a customer sent back a steak for the 3rd time, insisting it was cooked wrong. She smiled, even when someone left a mess of crumbs and spilled sauce for her to clean up. Treating the table as if it were their own personal dumpster. She smiled, and she cleaned it up without a word. The restaurant was a stage, and the diners were the actors in their own dramas. She was just part of the crew, making sure the set was perfect for their performance. She saw everything. She saw the secret glances between business partners who were about to betray each other. She saw the strained smiles of couples on the verge of a breakup, putting on a brave face for public view. She saw the genuine, easy laughter of old friends who hadn't seen each other in years. She was a silent observer of 1,000 different lives, none of which would ever intersect with her own beyond this room. She was a ghost in their world, watching them live. Tonight was particularly busy. A large party had taken up the center section, their loud, boisterous laughter filling the space. They were celebrating some kind of business deal, judging by their talk of mergers and acquisitions. One of them, a man with a red face and a booming voice, called her over. "You girl," he said, waving a hand. "Another round of the same for everyone. And make it quick." He didn't look at her. He looked through her as if she were a piece of glass. She nodded, her smile never faltering, and turned back towards the kitchen. As she walked, she passed by the small raised platform in the corner of the room where a grand piano sat. Tonight a man was playing soft, classical melodies, his fingers dancing lightly over the keys. The music was a gentle current flowing beneath the noise of the room. For a moment she paused, her head tilted slightly. It was a piece she knew well, a complex and beautiful sonata. Her own fingers curled around her order pad twitched almost unconsciously, tracing the patterns of the notes in the air. She could feel the music in her bones, a familiar comfort in this unfamiliar world of wealth. Then a voice from another table called out, "Miss, can we get the check?" And the spell was broken. She was a waitress again. She straightened her back, smoothed her apron, and went back to work. The hours bled into one another. The dining room slowly emptied as the night grew late. The parties left, leaving behind half-eaten plates, empty glasses, and the faint scent of their perfume and cologne. The final tables paid their bills and departed, stepping out into the cool night air to be whisked away by taxis or expensive cars. The young woman and the rest of the staff began the long process of cleaning, of resetting the stage for the next day's performance. They wiped down tables, polished silverware, and swept the floors, all in a comfortable, tired silence. They were the crew, cleaning up after the show. Finally, her shift was over. She changed out of her uniform into her own clothes, a pair of jeans and a simple sweater. She said her quiet goodbyes to the other staff and stepped out the back door into the alley. The cool night air felt like a shock to her system after the stuffy, overheated restaurant. The city was still alive, but it was a different kind of alive now. The quiet hum of the elite was replaced by the distant wail of a siren and the chatter of people heading home from bars. She pulled her thin jacket tighter around her and began the long walk to her apartment. Her apartment was on the third floor of an old building, a long walk from the glittering world of l'Etoile Filante. It was small, and it was simple. The furniture was mismatched and secondhand. The walls were thin, but it was hers. It was her space, her sanctuary. She dropped her bag by the door and kicked off her sneakers, sighing in relief as the pressure was taken off her aching feet. She didn't turn on the lights, preferring to move through the familiar darkness. She walked past the small kitchen, past the tiny living room with its worn-out couch, and stopped in the corner. There, against the far wall, stood an old upright piano. It was scuffed and scratched. The ivory on a few of the keys was yellowed and chipped, and it was slightly out of tune. It was the most beautiful thing she owned. She had found it in a second-hand shop years ago and had spent every spare cent. She had to buy it and have it moved to her small apartment. It was her voice. It was her soul. She ran her fingers gently over the cool, smooth wood, the day's exhaustion melting away just by being near it. She sat down on the worn bench, the fabric frayed at the edges. She lifted the lid to reveal the keys. And in the dim light filtering through the window, she placed her fingers on them, ready to finally speak. The next day, the air in l'Etoile Filante was different. It wasn't just thick with the usual scent of wealth. It was crackling with a nervous energy that made the staff move a little faster, speak a little quieter. The owner, a man with a neatly trimmed mustache and a perpetually worried look, was pacing the length of the dining room, his polished shoes sinking silently into the carpet. He kept stopping to adjust a fork that was already perfectly straight, or to squint at a wine glass that was already spotless. Tonight was not just any night. Tonight, the restaurant was playing host to a private dinner that had the entire city's elite buzzing. A reclusive tech billionaire, a man who hadn't been photographed in years, was coming. So was the world-famous orchestra conductor, known for his sharp ear and even sharper tongue. The owner's reputation, and perhaps the restaurant's future, rested on this single evening going perfectly. Everything had to be flawless. The young woman felt the tension in her shoulders as she meticulously polished a set of silver wine goblets. She could see the stress etched on the faces of her co-workers. The usually jovial chef was barking orders in the kitchen, his voice a low, constant growl. The other servers moved with a tense, robotic precision, their smiles looking more like grimaces. She focused on her task, on the simple, repetitive motion of the cloth against the silver, letting it calm her. She had learned long ago that the best way to survive in a high-pressure environment was to create a small, quiet bubble around yourself and not let the chaos in. An hour before the guests were scheduled to arrive, the restaurant's pianist came in. He was an older man, with a severe face and hands that were surprisingly delicate. He carried his leather-bound folder of sheet music as if it were a sacred text. He nodded curtly to the owner, but ignored the rest of the staff, his eyes already fixed on the grand piano waiting for him in the corner. He was a professional, brought in for evenings like this, a living piece of the expensive decor. He saw the young woman polishing silverware and gave her a dismissive glance, as if she were part of the furniture he had to walk around. She was used to that, too. To him, she was just the help, invisible and unimportant. The pianist walked towards the small platform where the piano sat, his path taking him past a table that had just been reset. One of the junior staff in a hurry had left a chair pushed out slightly too far. The pianist, his mind already on the complex melodies he was about to play, didn't see it. His foot caught the leg of the chair, and he stumbled. It wasn't a dramatic fall, more of a clumsy, off-balance trip, but it was enough. He flailed, trying to regain his footing, and his folder of sheet music flew from his grasp. The papers burst out, scattering across the floor like a flock of white birds. He landed hard on his outstretched hand, and a sharp cry of pain cut through the quiet tension of the room. There was a sickening crack, audible even from a distance. For a moment, everyone froze. The chefs yelling from the kitchen stopped. The clatter of pans ceased. All eyes were on the crumpled figure of the pianist on the floor. Then chaos erupted. The young woman and another server rushed to his side. He was clutching his right wrist to his chest, his face pale and twisted in agony. His wrist was already beginning to swell, turning an angry shade of red. "It's broken," he gasped, his voice tight with pain. "I think it's broken." The owner, his face a mask of horror, ran over, his earlier worry now replaced by full-blown panic. "Marcel, my God, Marcel, are you all right?" But the question was pointless. Marcel was clearly not all right, and more importantly, he could not play. The owner helped the pianist to his feet and half-carried him towards a back office, shouting for someone to call an ambulance. The rest of the staff stood around looking at each other in shock and confusion. The scattered sheet music lay on the floor, a silent testament to the disaster. The owner re-emerged from the office a moment later, his face slick with sweat. He looked at his watch, then at the empty piano, then at his watch again. 1 hour, he yelled, his voice cracking. "We have 1 hour. What are we going to do?" He began to pace again, but this time it was a frantic caged animal pace. He pulled out his phone, his fingers flying across the screen as he scrolled through contacts. He called every music school, every agency, every number he could think of. The answers were all the same. "An hour? It's impossible. Everyone is booked. Can't find a quality pianist on such short notice." Panic was contagious. The staff started to scatter, trying to find something to do to make themselves useful. But their efforts were clumsy and unfocused. One started to gather the scattered sheet music, then stopped, not knowing what to do with it. Another began wiping down a table that was already clean. The air was thick with the owner's desperation. He was muttering to himself, running his hands through his perfectly styled hair, messing it up. The music, the ambiance. "It's everything," he whispered to no one in particular. "They will walk right out. He will walk right out." The evening was falling apart before it had even begun. The perfect, flawless dinner was turning into a catastrophe, and through it all, the young woman stood quietly to the side, having finished polishing the silver. She watched the scene unfold, her heart starting to beat a little faster in her chest. She saw the owner's despair, the staff's helplessness. She looked at the grand piano, sitting silent and empty in the corner of the room. It looked like a throne with no king. For years, she had been a ghost in this room, a silent observer. She had served the wealthy and listened to their conversations, all while holding a world of music inside her that no one here knew about. She had played on her old beat-up piano in her small apartment until her fingers were sore, pouring all her unspoken feelings into the keys, and now, here it was. A crisis. A need. An empty piano. A room full of people who needed music and no one to play it. She felt a strange mix of fear and a thrilling, terrifying spark of opportunity. Her hands, which had been still at her sides, began to feel restless, itching. She took a deep, shaky breath, the sound of the owner's panicked voice fading into the background as her focus narrowed, homing in on the silent, gleaming black and white keys. The owner's panic was a living thing in the room, a wild, frantic energy that made the air feel thin and sharp. He slammed his phone down on the bar, the loud crack making the other servers flinch. "No one," he yelled, his voice raw. "No one is available an hour. They act like I'm asking for the moon." He began to pace again, his movements sharp and jerky. He looked at the grand piano sitting in the corner, a beautiful silent monument to his impending failure. To him it wasn't an instrument anymore. It was a tombstone for his career. The guests would be arriving soon. The tech billionaire, the conductor, the mayor's wife. They were all expecting an evening of impeccable sophistication. What they were going to get was silence and a sweating. Restaurant owner with no plan, the staff tried to make themselves invisible. They busied themselves with unnecessary tasks, wiping down already spotless surfaces, rearranging salt and pepper shakers that were already perfectly aligned. They were all thinking the same thing. This was going to be a disaster. When the owner went down, he might take them all with him. The junior server, who had accidentally left the chair out, was hiding in the kitchen, on the verge of tears. The atmosphere was so thick with tension it was hard to breathe. The young woman stood apart from the rest, her hands clasped in front of her. She watched the owner, a man who had always carried himself with an air of unshakable control, now completely unraveled. She saw the desperation in his eyes, the way his hands trembled slightly. For a moment she felt a pang of pity for him. But then she remembered all the times he had looked through her, all the times he had demanded perfection without a word of thanks. She remembered the condescending way he spoke to the staff when they made a mistake. This was his world, a world built on appearances and service, and it was crumbling. Her gaze drifted back to the piano. It stood there, waiting. She thought of her own piano at home, the one with the chipped keys and the worn-out bench. She thought of the countless hours she had spent there, playing until her fingers ached and her mind was quiet. She thought of the music that lived inside her, a world so rich and complex that no one here could ever imagine. For years she had been a container for this music, carrying it with her silently through the aisles of the restaurant, letting it flow through her as she poured wine and cleared plates. It was her secret, her most private self, and now that secret had a chance to be heard. The thought was terrifying. A cold shiver ran down her spine. What if she wasn't good enough? What if her hands, which were so used to carrying trays, failed her? What if the wealthy guests, who were used to the best, laughed her out of the room? The fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but underneath the fear, something else was stirring. It was a tiny, warm spark of defiance. She was so tired of being invisible. She was so tired of being dismissed. This was more than just a chance to play the piano. It was a chance to be seen. The owner slumped against the bar, burying his face in his hands. "It's over," he mumbled into his palms. "It's all over." The other staff just stood there, their heads bowed in defeat. This was it, the moment of surrender, and in that moment the young woman's feet began to move. It felt like someone else was controlling them, pulling her forward across the room. Each step felt heavy, as if she were walking through mud. The other staff watched her, their eyes wide with confusion. She walked past them, her focus locked on the hunched figure of the owner. She stopped a few feet away from him. He didn't look up. "Monsieur," she said. Her voice was quiet, almost a whisper. But it cut through the heavy silence of the room. The owner slowly lifted his head, his eyes red-rimmed and filled with despair. When he saw her, his expression soured. "What?" he snapped, his voice harsh. "Can't you see I'm busy? Go polish something." He waved a dismissive hand at her, turning away as if to end the conversation. But she didn't move. "Monsieur," she said again, a little louder this time. "I can play." He turned back to face her, his disbelief quickly turning to anger. He looked her up and down, his eyes lingering on her simple black uniform and worn-out shoes. He let out a short, bitter laugh. "You?" he scoffed. "You can play? Play what? Chopsticks? This is not a child's birthday party. This is for the most important people in the city." His voice was laced with contempt, the same tone she had heard 100 times from the diners. She didn't flinch. She met his gaze, her own eyes steady and calm. "I can play whatever you'd like," she said, her voice clear and sure. For a moment, the owner just stared at her. He searched her face, looking for any sign of a joke, any hint of insanity. He saw none. All he saw was a quiet confidence that was completely at odds with her appearance. He was a man who judged people instantly, based on their clothes, their job, their posture. Everything about her screamed waitress. But her words. Her words were those of a master. His mind raced. The clock on the wall was ticking loudly, each tick a hammer blow against his skull. The guests would be arriving in less than 30 minutes. His options had run out. He could either cancel the dinner and face the humiliation and financial ruin, or he could take a gamble on this invisible girl. It was a ridiculous, insane idea. It was a risk that could make him the laughingstock of the city. But doing nothing was a guaranteed failure. Desperation, that wild and frantic animal, clawed at him, urging him to take the chance. He looked from her determined face to the silent, waiting piano. He thought of the conductor, the billionaire, the critical ears that would be listening. He thought of his own reputation. He took a deep, shaky breath, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. "Fine," he said, his voice sharp and strained, as if the word were being torn from his throat. He pointed a trembling finger at the piano. "Fine, go on. The guests will be arriving in 20 minutes. Do not," he added, his eyes narrowing, "do not embarrass me." It wasn't an offer. It was a command, a threat. The young woman gave a single, slow nod. She didn't smile. She didn't say thank you. She simply turned and walked towards the center of the empty dining room. The other staff watched her, their mouths slightly agape. They moved as if to part a sea for her, their disbelief palpable. She walked with a new purpose, her back straight, her steps sure. She was not a waitress walking to a table. She was an artist walking to her stage. She reached the platform and stepped up onto it. The grand piano seemed even bigger up close, its polished black surface reflecting the dim lights of the restaurant like a dark mirror. She ran a hand gently over the cool, smooth wood, a familiar gesture that calmed her racing heart. She pulled out the heavy bench and sat down, the worn velvet feeling comfortable beneath her. She looked out at the empty tables, the polished silverware, the pristine wine glasses waiting to be filled. This room, which had made her feel so small and insignificant for so long, now felt different. From this seat it looked like an audience hall, and she was about to speak. She took one last deep breath, raised her hands, and placed her fingers on the ivory keys, ready to finally let her voice be heard. The first of the guests began to arrive, stepping out of their sleek black cars and into the warm glow of the restaurant's entrance. They were a different breed from the usual diners. They carried an air of importance, a quiet confidence that filled the space before they even spoke. The owner, hovering near the door, greeted each one with a nervous smile that was more of a grimace, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. He kept glancing towards the corner of the room, where the young woman sat at the grand piano, a small, still figure in a sea of empty tables. She could feel their eyes on her as they were led to their seats. It was the same look she always got, a quick, dismissive glance that registered her uniform and then dismissed her entirely. But tonight, there was something more. There was a flicker of confusion, of annoyance. A woman in a sparkling diamond necklace leaned towards her companion and whispered something, gesturing subtly towards the piano with her champagne flute. A man in a tailored suit frowned as he sat down, his eyes lingering on her for a moment too long before he turned his attention to the menu. They had expected the older, distinguished pianist. They had gotten a waitress. To them, it was a sign of cheapness, a crack in the perfect facade of lead oil Falante. The owner saw the looks, and his heart sank. He felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. He wanted to run over and tell her to stop, to just let the room be silent, but it was too late. The guests were seated. The show, whatever it would be, had to go on. The young woman felt their judgment like a physical pressure, but she pushed it away. She closed her eyes for a second, blocking out the room, the people, the expectations. In the darkness behind her eyelids, there was only the music. She took a slow, deep breath and let her fingers settle onto the cool ivory keys. She began to play. She started with something soft, something gentle. It was a piece by Debussy, a melody that felt like gentle rain on a summer evening. The notes were light and airy, floating through the room like tiny, sparkling bubbles. The music was beautiful, but it was also background music. It was the kind of sound that was meant to be ignored, to simply add a layer of sophistication to the atmosphere. And for the first few minutes, it worked. The guests barely noticed. Their loud, confident conversations filled the space, weaving around the gentle melody like a river around a stone. They talked about stock market fluctuations, about a new art gallery opening, about the scandalous divorce of a mutual friend. The tech billionaire, a man known for his brilliant mind and social awkwardness, had his phone out on the table, his fingers swiping and tapping, completely absorbed in his own world. The owner watched from the doorway to the kitchen, his hands clenched into fists. It was fine. It was pleasant, but it wasn't special. It wasn't the kind of music that would impress this crowd. It was the kind of music you heard in a hotel lobby. He felt a fresh wave of despair wash over him. His gamble was not paying off. Then something shifted. The gentle rain of notes stopped. There was a brief, almost imperceptible pause, a breath of silence. And then a new sound erupted from the piano. It was a torrent, a flood of sound that was both fierce and beautiful. Her fingers, which had been moving so delicately, now flew across the keys with a blinding speed and power. It was a Chopin etude, a piece of music so technically difficult and emotionally charged that it was considered a masterpiece of the repertoire. The melody was a storm, full of passion, sorrow, and a breathtaking, defiant joy. The change was so sudden, so violent, that it was impossible to ignore. A man in the middle of a sentence stopped talking, his fork frozen halfway to his mouth. The woman with the diamonds stopped whispering, her head turning towards the piano with a look of sharp annoyance that quickly melted into confusion. The first person to truly react was the orchestra conductor. He had been nodding along politely to the Debussy, his professional mind cataloging the simple melody. But when the Chopin began, his head snapped up. His eyes, which had been half closed in boredom, were now wide open, fixed on the young woman's hands. He leaned forward in his seat, his entire body tense with concentration. He was no longer a guest. He was a colleague, a master craftsman watching another perform an impossible feat. The effect rippled through the room like a shockwave. Conversations faltered and died. One by one, people put down their silverware. They turned in their seats, their faces a mixture of surprise and disbelief. The tech billionaire, without looking away from the piano, slowly pushed his phone across the table until it was out of his sight. The music demanded their full attention. It was not background noise anymore. It was the main event. The young woman was lost in it. The world had shrunk to the 88 keys beneath her fingers. She was no longer a waitress in a fancy restaurant. She was not the invisible girl. She was the music. Her body swayed with the powerful rhythm, her eyes closed, her face a canvas of raw emotion. She was pouring years of longing, of frustration, of quiet dreams into every single note. All the nights she had spent alone in her small apartment, all the times she had felt small and overlooked, all the beauty she had held inside her, it was all spilling out now, filling the room with a sound so powerful it felt alive. The final passage of the piece was a whirlwind of sound, a dizzying, breathtaking cascade of notes that built to a crescendo of impossible intensity. And then, silence. She played the final chord. And the sound hung in the air for a moment, a single perfect vibration that seemed to suspend time. The silence that followed was even more profound than the music. It was a heavy, sacred silence, the kind that falls in a place where something miraculous has just happened. No one moved. No one breathed. They just sat there, staring at the young woman at the piano, their faces stripped of their usual masks of wealth and indifference. They were just people, utterly and completely captivated. The silence was broken by a single sound. The orchestra conductor slowly and deliberately brought his hands together in a soft clap. It was a gesture of pure, unadulterated respect. It was the spark that lit the fire. In an instant, the entire room erupted. It wasn't just polite applause. It was a roar, a thunderous, overwhelming wave of sound that shook the very foundations of the restaurant. People were on their feet, their faces flushed with emotion. their applause a desperate attempt to release the tension and awe that filled the room. The owner stood frozen by the kitchen door, his face a mask of shock and wonder. He looked at the young woman who was still sitting at the piano, her chest heaving, her hands resting on the keys, as if she had just run a marathon. He saw her not as a waitress anymore, but as something he had never expected, something he couldn't have possibly imagined. And in that moment, he knew his restaurant was not ruined. It had just become legendary.